The Mattasher Show is made possible by Key West Adventures. See more of Key West. And by Bascom Grooms Real Estate, selling property in the Keys since the early 1900s. And by Keys Weekly, bringing the world to the Florida Keys and the Florida Keys to the world.
My guest today is the author of 3 graphic memoirs. Each one combines imaginative, highly detailed, historically precise illustrations with narration, dialogue, and extensive literary references. Her first memoir became a Time magazine Book of the Year, a Broadway hit, and is in the process of being turned into a movie. She's become a part of the culture with an eponymous test that's applied to works of fiction. On top of it all, she has a new workout that might just overtake Jane Fonda's, leg warmers optional.
Hey. I'm Matt. Nice to meet you.
Hey, Matt.
Pleasure. Welcome to Lost Boy Creations.
Thank you.
Of course. Let me show you around.
Please. Those are beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, we started building boards and boats in St. John in the Virgin Islands about 6 years ago. And through a series of different events, wound up here in Key West. And
Are you a surfer?
Yeah, in another lifetime. Unfortunately, I'm a fish out of water in a place where there's no waves.
Yeah, like I just saw those huge waves. They don't have those here, do they?
No, unfortunately not.
That's why you have these kind of boards.
Yeah, and I still make some of the traditional surfboards rather just to kind of keep myself close to the sport. It keeps me in tune with something I really enjoy doing. So it's a means of being close to something I love.
So these look like they must weigh 800 pounds unless they're hollow.
That's the impression most people have, yeah. These are actually hollow boards, and all the wood that's here is all locally sourced. So we mill all of our own wood. Most of it came down in Key West proper or up in Stock Island. Yeah, exactly. You can hear how hollow they are. But this is rainbow eucalyptus that came from Big Pine. And it was amazing, actually, the other day, the people who had the tree on their property tracked it down and came down to see what we've been building with it.
Wow.
And then the Cuban mahogany here is all from Key West proper, some of the main streets here. I believe that this was from Green Street, which is over by Sloppy Joe's and Captain Tony's. It's amazing to be able to see a piece of wood that you knew was a tree at one point, and then to take it all the way down to a workable piece of wood.
Does that information somehow stay attached to the board? Like?
Oh yeah, I usually give a write-up on all the boards and the paddles as far as where the wood came from.
Cool.
If you know anything about the property it came from, or the type of wood it is, care instructions, things like that. But it definitely adds a whole new dimension to a piece of functional art, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Having that kind of intimate connection with the wood or with a place that you really love. A lot of people that come down here are so excited to have a piece of Key West, something so unique and different. It makes a big difference.
So do you sell these to people all over the place?
Mm-hmm. In fact, we've got one going to Charlottesville that I have yet to start making, but this is a good friend of mine's paddleboard from Minnesota. And they come down here and travel here on a regular basis, so they decided to keep it.
Oh, nice.
They're kind enough to let me borrow it when I decide. And I'd love to have you take it for a ride if you'd like to.
This one?
Yeah.
Great.
Of course, and we've got a custom paddle over here that goes along with it. It should be just about your size as well. We'll get you all set up with the paddle and paddle board.
So are the boards are like one kind of uniform size, but the paddles vary?
They also vary as well. The top board here is 11'2". That was something I made for myself to do some fishing off of. This is a 10-foot board, which is a little bit more of a standard size for paddleboard. Just kind of an all-around paddler, as you may. So it's not necessarily designed for racing or fishing. It's just something for everyone to go out and enjoy.
People race these? I had no idea.
Yeah, it's actually, I had no idea until I moved here either, but it definitely is a really big, it's a big event, and they have the Keys Paddle Classic here as well, which is one of a number of races from around the country that people travel to really compete in an elite class.
Wow.
Yeah, I had no idea.
Do they like make a wake as they speed along?
Yeah, in fact, somebody has asked me to commission, well, they've commissioned me to build a board specifically for a race from Key West to the Dried Tortugas, which is about 70 miles. And so we're designing a custom board specifically for that event, which will be pretty, it'll be a challenge to say the least.
Wow. Thank you.
See you again.
Nice
Make
to see
yourself
you.
right at home.
Wow.
Watch your step as you get on board. We're ready to roll whenever you are.
Welcome to Moray Bay, Alison.
Thank you.
How was the paddleboard?
Oh my God, it was so much fun.
Awesome. Did you see any critters, any manatee?
No manatee, but we saw rays, these quite large, flat fish things zipping underneath us. I almost stepped on one, in fact.
Well, I'm glad that you didn't and that you didn't get Irwined.
Oh yeah, I heard about that. No.
And made it out here.
Yeah, me too. Here we are.
Here we are. I wanted to have you on. You recently released the third book in a series of autobiographical comics. Your first and most well-known graphic memoir, Fun Home, is about growing up in around a funeral home and your relationship with your father. The second book is about your mother. The last one, The Secret to Superhuman Strength, is about your relationship to what used to be called physical robustness. All three works are about the particularities of your own life and upbringing, yet clearly they have a universality that goes way beyond the Venn diagram category of one that you inhabit. I have my own thoughts on why your works succeed so broadly, but I want to begin with what you think makes your books compelling to so many people.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, it's hard for me even to, the first thing I wanted to say was, well, are they interesting to so many people? But I guess, yes, I've been selling a lot of these books.
Selling a lot of the books and getting them turned into Broadway musicals and films.
Well,
Usually an indicator.
in the case of Fun Home, yeah. It's still funny to me, though. I guess I consider myself still kind of an outsider. I mean, that's how I started in my career, and even as I've, you know, gotten a larger and broader readership, it's hard for me to really accept that I've crossed over into, you know, that kind of more mainstream stature. But yes, okay, so let's say there's a lot of people who read these books. Why? I don't know. I mean, it seems funny to me. I wrote this very, very particular book about, you know, growing up as a lesbian with my closeted gay father who's a funeral director. Who would think that would have struck a chord? But it did somehow.
I think for me, there are two things that I think make it compelling. One is that it's just really hard to make a compelling story out of something that isn't like a war film or something that has in it an inherent drama that drives it forward with an automatic tension. And there is the mystery of how your father died, but really you're able to do something compelling in the context of a story that doesn't rely on something that you'd say to yourself, oh, that is an immediate point of life and death. The fate of the world is so to be able to do that is an impressive feat.
Yeah, in fact, I didn't even want my father's death to be any kind of suspense. I reveal that at the very beginning of the story, because what I was interested in as I wrote about him was not what happened, not the things that happened, but all the ideas and associations and feelings around it. And so I just had to find a way to sort those out. And for me, that's partly the writing, you know, learning how to tell a narrative in a way that makes sense, but also the images. Like, for me to tell stories, the pictures are an integral part of it.
I noticed that too. There's often an interplay between the words and then the images. There's often a hidden joke or Easter egg there for the readers in all of your books.
Well, yeah, I like the images to be as dense and worthy of your, you know, your decoding or deciphering attention as the words. Like, I want you to be able to read the images in the same way you would read the text.
So the other thing that I find really compelling about it is that, or I think that makes it compelling, is that it's an essentially American work in the sense that you, as the protagonist, as the character, you're infused with a Protestant work ethic. Your latest book has the wonderful quote, "If I had to be away from my work, the least I could do was suffer and sweat." You're also obsessed with self-improvement, driven, tuned in to your own consumerism, and on a spiritual quest without being bound to the doctrine of any particular religion. In short, you kind of are America.
I never thought of it that way, but yeah, that's pretty American. kind of the Marlboro Man. I like the idea of being like an American. I mean, I feel like in some ways I've fought to make myself be seen as an American cartoonist, because for so long I was a pigeonholed cartoonist. I was a lesbian cartoonist, which I was fine with and very proud of identifying that way. But yeah, it's kind of wild to think that I'm speaking to a larger group of people, and I don't know, it's my gears in my brain are going, because I really don't think of myself in this kind of generic way. I still always feel like such a very particular case.
Like you're in that little subset of the Venn diagram and not
tiny
seeing
little subset. Yeah.
the broader overlaps
Yeah.
there.
But I like this idea.
Oh, I'm glad you do. So the other thing in terms of how you think about yourself through the novels is that all three of them are about yourself, but throughout your works, the boundary between your life and the lives of fictional characters and even other authors blurs. I'm going to read another quote here, one from Are You My Mother, that captures this phenomenon. The concept of transference has so thoroughly entered our vernacular that it's easy to overlook its alchemical power. We essentially turn one person into another.
This is from my book where I'm trying to figure out therapy and explain it to the reader. I never thought
Right?
of that as a kind of transference.
Do you think that is or not? You're free to say it isn't.
I mean, I'm just, when I think of transference in that quote that you read, I'm thinking of it in this very particular psychological sense of transferring my feelings for one person onto another person.
Right, the therapeutic. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, and then we'll see if there's an overlap there.
Yeah, transference. I mean, in a therapeutic relationship, in an analytic relationship, when it's working, the patient is transferring their, early primal feelings onto the analyst, literally transferring it. And so you can see in the feelings that come up for the analyst what the person's original feelings were for their parent.
I think maybe I see then a different kind of transference as core to what you're doing.
Okay.
In the sense that it's almost like, let me read another quote if I can here, continuing with that idea, maybe not
Okay.
as it should be understood, but how I think about it, maybe the non-therapeutic way was, you say in Fun Home, perhaps affectation can be so thoroughgoing, so authentic in its details, that it stops being pretense and becomes, for all practical purposes, real. So the idea being that in your books, you are mixing elements from your own life with others, and with others, both real writers and their characters, and they all seem to get kind of jumbled up and roles are taken on. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's just because of the nature of my family growing up. My parents were these very artistic people. Both my parents loved literature and poetry. My mother was an actress. They loved the theater. My father was like a design guru. He was always restoring our old Victorian house. So they were, but in their absorption in these creative activities, they were quite remote, quite distant from their roles as parents. Like I would, want their attention, and they were busy off being in a play or tearing down the front porch. And so it was sort of a natural thing for me to think of them in a way as fictional characters. There was that aesthetic distance that I had with them.
What you're saying with that quote in particular is that your father is almost seeing himself as a fictional character, but he's imagining it in such a rigorous level of detail that it almost becomes real?
Yeah, for all practical purposes.
He's performing a
There's
particular...
a lot of performance, yes. There's a high degree of performativity in our household growing up. Not only were they doing these artistic things, but they were, my father was this closeted gay or bisexual man, and so they were, performing as if that were not the case, as if they were just like this normal couple with kids, but it was always a performance, So growing up I didn't know that, I didn't find that out until I was in college, but looking back, it was always sort of like there was a show being put on,
Do you think that spilled over into the way you think about your own life?
Looking back, I can see that my desire to just live as this open out lesbian, like essentially making it my job, writing and drawing a lesbian comic strip. Like that was, I think, very much a reaction to my father's secretive life.
How so?
I saw how much it damaged him, how much it damaged our family to, you know, to live with that kind of shame. I think he was very, you know, he didn't feel like he could be open about this. And so there were just all these layers of lies and subterfuge.
Well, it's interesting. So you kind of went the other way in the face of the option to sort of hide it or pretend. You went very explicit and overt.
Yes, I became an exhibitionist about it. I mean, it wasn't like I consciously made that decision. I'm just looking back and interpreting my behavior now, but I feel like that was at work. You know, I wanted to undo the secrecy, undo the shame, make it, you know, normal to be gay or lesbian. Like that became my mission. So people didn't have to, you know, create these elaborate ruses in their lives.
One of the things that that kind of makes us insiders or outsiders, of course, is our identity. And there's no way to talk about your work without talking about identity, and in particular, group identity, which can be a tricky subject to say the least. You began your career drawing comics specifically for the lesbian community, and sexual identity is a key part of your work. You're also the inadvertent creator of what's come to be known as the Bechdel test. Could you explain what that is, and equally importantly, your thoughts on how it's become part of the culture?
I like that you slipped the word inadvertent in there, because that's key. I wrote a comic strip in 1985. I don't even know how many years ago that was. I can't do the math that far back. A long time ago, I did an episode of my little lesbian comic strip where two women were trying to decide what movie they were going to go see. And one of them said, well, I have a rule. I will only see a movie if it has at least two women in it who talk to each other about something besides a man. It has to meet those three criteria. And it was actually very, very difficult for them to find a movie. The only movie they could go see was Alien, because the two women in it talked to each other about the monster. So that was just like a little in-joke that my lesbian feminist friends and I found amusing. But over the years, like somehow that idea has just kind of made its way out into the broader culture. And people are using it as an actual gauge of whether a movie treats its female characters as full, you know, subjects, full human beings, which is really kind of cool. I mean, it's a catchy idea. It wasn't even, here's the thing, it wasn't even my idea. I stole it in 1985 from a friend, because I was like, my deadline was coming due and I didn't have an idea for my comic strip, so I just repeated this thing my friend had said the day before. So I always feel a little guilty that somehow now it has my name attached to it, when really it was my friend Liz's idea. Actually, it wasn't even Liz's idea. I think it's kind of Virginia Woolf's idea. I think it's actually the idea of a room of one's own boiled down into this little simple formula.
Throughout your books, you mention a variety of different writers, Virginia Woolf among them, and your own identity in some ways almost seems mixed up with the identities of the writers, or at least their stories become almost merged with yours. You see parallels, overlaps, ways in which you're similar. To what extent do you think that mixing of identities happens in your books?
You know, I haven't really thought about this, but hearing you say that just now, I feel like I was raised in a very literary household. Both my parents loved to read literature and poetry, and they were always, my father especially was always trying to get me to read books that he liked. And another piece of what was going on in my family is that my parents, my very artistic parents, who had lots of creative interests. My parents were distant, but they were also very creative. And I think in this way I began to think of them as almost as fictional characters. And I guess in my own life, in my own work, I'm always putting a literary figure in between me and my experience. Like I need some other character to help elucidate things.
So you understand the experience of your own reality through the fictional events? Or is that not quite right?
I think it's something like that. You know, having these parents who I came to see as almost fictional characters, it just became familiar and comfortable to work with and through other writers or characters.
Does that give you an insight into your own life? Does it make it seem more comfortable because it's more familiar?
I think it's a kind of distancing technique, you know, like I do divulge a lot about my own particular life and self, but I somehow feel like mediating it through other characters is even more powerful.
So that particular kind of transference, perhaps not the therapeutic transference or mixing of identities, leads you to embed various works of art that are from what's generally known as the canon, the literary canon, the set of works that educated Americans are expected to know. I want to talk about that for a moment because I have decidedly non-positive thoughts about the canon as such, not because it doesn't contain some very good works, because it seems to me like an ossification of cultural hegemonies, random choices, and sometimes just dumb inertia. My take is that maybe we should clear out the canon, purge everything from William Shakespeare to Alice Walker, and start fresh, or else shatter the entire idea of the canon of must-read books.
It's funny, my mother would have loved that idea. She often felt that authors shouldn't be allowed to keep publishing under their own names, like that people just sort of got, you know, once an author made it big, anything they wrote would get published. So she felt like every book should be judged on its own merits, not because so-and-so wrote it.
So maybe they should just be numbers instead of names.
You know, so my book Fun Home does have all these literary references in it, because one of the ways Fun Home is a memoir about my relationship with my father, and at the time I started writing it, he'd been dead for 20 years. And so one of the ways I tried to like reconnect with him was by looking at the books that he loved and that he was always trying to get me to read. So that's why the particular books are there that I chose. There's James Joyce, there's Proust, there's F. Scott Fitzgerald, you know, pretty canonical writers.
Your father clearly believed in the idea of a canon.
Yes, yes. Unlike my mother, he had his own view. He loved, you know, just the idea of a great writer. It was very romantic to him. So he loved all these guys. And I didn't go into that project with the idea of, you know, blowing up the canon, but in a way, that's what came of it. You know, like I was taking that patriarchal canon, I'm thinking of like an actual physical cannon with cannonballs, and kind of reappropriating it, like telling my particular story as a woman, as a lesbian, through the lens of Ulysses. You know, like I'm a great mythic hero just like Ulysses. Like that, I was kind of, you know, I'm kind of subverting the canon in that way. But that wasn't what I went into it thinking I was going to do. That just kind of is what happened.
Well, it's interesting. So embrace it and claim it to some extent as related to your own life.
Yeah.
Would you force the kids of America to read a set of canonical works?
So as a kid, my brothers and I loved this card game, Authors.
Authors?
It's basically Go Fish, but on the cards are printed all these famous authors, or people who were once famous. Like it was Alfred Lord Tennyson and Sir Walter Scott and Charles Dickens, Mark Twain. Like they probably developed this game in the, I don't know, 1920s or 30s, something like that, when that was the canon. But we'd never heard of these people, or we'd heard of them, but we'd certainly never read anything by Alfred Lord Tennyson. But we'd play this card game as if we knew these writers intimately, and we'd be naming their books and trying to collect little,
Like
sets
baseball cards, basically.
Yeah, yeah. It was a canon that is now, doesn't apply anymore. They probably still make that card game, but I bet they've changed the authors. Anyhow, all that is to say, canons can be quite, as you said, ossified and, counterproductive. Like, why force people to read stuff that feels like a burden or an obligation? Let people, seek out and find the stuff that moves them and touches them.
That's basically my perspective, at any rate, is that maybe we just don't need even the idea of this set of exalted writers that are the standard, that everyone should, you have to, what was the Greek quote about, let no one who hasn't learned geometry walk through these doors, that idea of a canon being almost a gatekeeping for intellectualism, I don't like that.
Right. Also, it kind of ruins some books that really are worth reading because you're put off from them. Like, I never read Coleridge or Wordsworth until quite recently because they just seemed like something I should read. I didn't know they were actually good.
That happens, right? When you're forced through a particular door, sometimes you resent that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, especially growing up the child of English teachers. I mean, I had to find a way to rebel, and the way I rebelled was to refuse to read Leaves of Grass. That was my big stand that I made.
Heresy.
I know.
He was gay,
I know, and it's an amazing poem. Anyhow.
So one of the things that I think about when considering the Bechdel test, which I like actually all lenses on the world, and I don't think that we can really have too many of them. So the Bechdel test is a particular way to filter or a lens through which to view current or I guess past literature, movies, cultural artifacts. And actually, from my perspective, there's probably some other test about the deepness of conversations to be had that isn't necessarily related to group identity. But group identity is an interesting one in that maybe there's something there as far as transference goes, maybe another type of the word transference, in that you're transferring something of your individual character to the group. You're giving it up or subsuming certain characteristics. And I think something that's been interesting in particular in kinds of communities that, like the lesbian or gay community, is that sometimes you end up letting your enemies define you or impact you in a strong way. My ex, who worked in Capitol Hill doing home care for AIDS patients for a while, once said that being hated does funny things to you. And one of the things that it can do is create a group cohesion, for better or worse, often for better, and energize. But it can also create something like a funhouse mirror version of your own identity within the group, or the group that is that identity almost at 110%, as if you've leaned into the perceived image or stereotype of your own group. Does that make sense?
I'm thinking of the ways that internalized homophobia affects people, which is not what you're talking about, but let me just start talking about that and maybe I'll latch on. As a young person coming out into a culture that was pretty hostile at the time towards people like me and my friends, it was very healing to have this cohesive group.
So, for example, there's a subculture within the gay male community that's hypermasculine or hypersexualized. And a lot of the culture, the gay culture, was driven forward by that subset, by bathhouse culture, if you will, which is perhaps to some extent in that sense, it's a reflection of the worst from the perspective of the other, right? Or from the perspective of, you see where I'm getting at?
Yes, that people are forming their identities in reaction to
There's
what's
a
out there.
reactivity,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yes. Yes. I mean, from my perspective, that I learned to frame all of those kinds of behaviors that you're mentioning as radical, as revolutionary, as undoing the mainstream culture.
There's a historian, Thaddeus Russell, and one of his ideas is that groups that are considered to be subhuman in one way or another by the dominant culture often actually have two things that happen. One is that their quality of life can be radically degraded, but the other is that sometimes there's a certain freedom for them to establish culture without the pressures of conformity. In other words, once you're outside the gates of polite society doesn't actually really care what you do. And sometimes that opens up the door for a kind of freedom or a liberation from conventional morality. Do you think any of that has happened in those kind of, in the culture that you've been part of?
Yeah, I feel like that whole phenomenon is something I have really been paying attention to, and in some ways was writing about in my comic strip over the years. The generation of people I came of age with, the generation of gay people, were very much radicals, very much outsiders. They didn't want to get married. When I was, coming out at 19 or 20, it never occurred to me that I would ever marry another woman. That was just like, it wasn't the point, I was going to live outside of the rules, which is very appealing, But what happened over these 3-4 decades is that that once radical movement just became gradually more and more assimilated. Their goals became more and more conventional. Marriage became the focus of the LGBTQ movement. I got married. It's been this really strange transformation from being outsiders, radicals, thinking we were going to undo this, all the trammels of patriarchal culture, but in many ways we just kind of bought into it.
Or did you become the new boss?
Oh, God. Well, one of the things, my mission with my comic strip, with Dykes to Watch Out For, as a young person was, I wanted to make people see that lesbians were just regular people, even though secretly in my head I thought that queer people were actually kind of more highly evolved than straight people, because they were so aware of, we could see the systems of oppression that were in place because we were suffering from them. We were on the outside of this oppressive system. We wanted to change the system, I guess, is what I'm saying, and instead the system changed us. We did change the system, but the system, it always goes both ways, There was things that were lost and things that were gained.
The system is absorptive.
It is.
Is that a word? Absorptive? Something like that.
It is absorptive and ever evolving.
It's a Borg.
Yes.
What was the Borg?
I don't know.
I don't think I do either.
But no, it's interesting to me how the culture finds things that are threatening to it, like, I don't know, a bunch of radical lesbians, and then finds ways to defang it, to take aspects that are, or any outsiders, like hip hop culture, like find a way to take the threat and make it into something you can sell back to people. That's what our culture is very good at doing.
It does. It transmutes. It takes off certain edges and repackages it in ways that are less sharp-edged.
Yeah.
And it also does a certain kind of misdirection. There's a comedian, Dave Smith, who has a bit about how what grew up in the wake of so there was the whole 99% movement in the wake of the financial crisis in '08. And there were people screaming for the banks' heads. There were people who were very upset about the bailouts. There was a little bit of a revolution brewing, right? People were very upset. And his theory is that what spilled out of that was a misdirect in the form of woke culture. We won't give you any structural changes to the banking sector, but we will change the composition of group identity of our boards.
Right.
Or we'll do certain things that are essentially virtue signaling that don't actually cost anything or change
Yeah.
anything at a deeper level.
Yeah. I mean, it's greenwashing and pinkwashing. People find ways to make themselves look like, oh, they're gay friendly or they're environmentally friendly while they're doing something terrible somewhere else,
I don't think actually ultimately corporate America, so to speak, cares one way or another about the gay agenda. It's easy enough to put up flags, and they all do now, which makes it part of the dominant culture. I wonder.
Oh yeah, it's really kind of alarming. Like Target selling all this pride merchandise, flags and rainbow T-shirts. Like that's really creepy to me.
Tell me more about that.
To just so brazenly commodify this symbol of liberation. It's just, so the opposite of what it's all about. And young people don't know that. They just go to Target and buy the rainbow T-shirts. In some ways that's cool, because maybe they're buying the rainbow T-shirt and they wouldn't have had a chance to think about being gay, but now they do. But still, I think something is lost. Some kind of authenticity.
Yeah.
Some kind of, some kind of genuine behavior gets lost when it's all being shoved down our throats by, a marketing department.
Is it even sustainable, though, that you could have a culture that's on the margins and that wins in the sense that they gain acceptance within the mainstream, but doesn't also lose something of their identity on assimilation?
No, I don't think it's possible. I think that's just how it works.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to come to terms with that for myself.
Is it a loss?
It is a loss, but I'm very happy not to be, having to live underground, or pretend that I'm married to a man. I mean, that's not so long ago. That's what people had to do.
Yeah, that's a win.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a trade-off. Everything's a trade-off.
For sure. To go in a little bit of a different direction here, one of the things that comes through in your work is just how much our modern lives need scaffolding of one kind or another. We have our Peloton classes, our yoga, our therapists, our masseuses. We have special gear for everything that we have, and we have restaurant delivery apps and all these other things. This is not a judgmental thing. I have my own scaffolding. Do you think that this is unique to our time, that we need this much kind of support for our everyday lives, or is this, it's just we have different supports?
Maybe this is just our way of making up for not having a real community anymore, not really having like churches that are part of the fabric of our lives, or, people don't live with their families anymore. Maybe this is how we console ourselves for not having that kind of connection in our lives, you know, by going to therapy, by going to Pilates class. I do think a lot of these exercise classes fulfill some kind of, you know, need for communal experience that we're otherwise lacking.
There's another substitution that I wonder about, which is, so there's an aspect in the books about your own, maybe it's struggles with OCD, and I wonder to what extent those kind of behaviors are substitutes for religion, that we have those quirks because we don't have one overarching faith or belief, like either you're doing something OCD or you're counting on your rosary.
Well, it's very striking to me how so many of my own personal obsessive compulsive behaviors were like religious ritual, you know, like you just have to do something the same way over and over again. And I really feel like a lot of religious ritual, that's exactly what they're doing. It's a kind of, you know, warding off of evil by doing this repetition. Don't know how well it's working for everyone.
So what does it do in your brain when you're doing those kinds of behaviors? What does that look like? And do you still engage in those kind of things?
I do. I hide it. I mask it now, but I still do these little tics and things almost all the time. I wish I could break the habit. It takes a lot of energy. But you know, there's like you get this little flickering sense of relief when you've done whatever the motion or action is. But then the tension starts up again and you have to just keep repeating it.
Like you've put everything right with the universe for that moment.
Right.
And then you have to repeat. Yeah.
Yeah.
But despite that, you've been extraordinarily productive. And I actually wonder sometimes if there isn't some link between productivity and a certain level of OCD-like driven behavior.
I do feel like I have found a way to successfully harness that tendency in me. Drawing cartoons is a very detail-oriented activity. There's a lot of repetition in it. It's a lot of obsessive compulsive behavior. And I actually end up with a, you know, viable product at the end instead of just crazy behavior.
Well, I think it certainly benefits at least from the attention to detail that you show. There's just an amazing, it's almost like you've created these documentaries or documents, and the detail in there, you have you know, the smelling salts packet, and you have, as far as I can tell, replicated it exactly like it would have been. And I imagine you researched everything from ticket stubs to old advertisements to get all of those little details right.
I do feel like I have some kind of graphic thing going on in my brain where I'm just very obsessed with graphic details. Literally graphic design, you know, lettering and logos. Like some people have, you know, a whole jukebox of music in their brain, but I have like all of these graphical images.
Could I get you to read from one of your books?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is from The Secret to Superhuman Strength.
All right. This is the semi-sadistic 7-minute workout. I should say that's based on a real workout, the scientific 7-minute workout. 12 exercises and you're done for. 1, rent a dumpster and in a grief-stricken haze, fill it with the contents of your dead mother's house. 2, rush to your dead mother's partner's deathbed when he, also grief-stricken, decides to stop treatment for his multiple illnesses. 3, rush off again in order to attend off-Broadway musical based on your family memoir. 4, round up wayward family members in logistically and emotionally complex operation for matinee of same. 5. On grueling round of speaking engagements, realize you are performing some kind of version of yourself. Wonder if this is what it's like to be a sex worker. 6. Fly to Comics Festival in France, give talk in English about your lesbian comic strip and gay dad to bewildered immigrant high school students. 7. Travel to Antipodes for a month of public appearances, note incremental but inexorable ebb of life force with each one. 8. While struggling to feel that you deserve to be at an artist's residency in Italy, learn that you have won a MacArthur Genius Grant and that the musical is moving to Broadway. 9. Become seized with a sense of profound fraudulence, made worse by knowledge that this is actually quite narcissistic and self-indulgent. 10. Participate in vast publicity mechanism to promote Broadway musical. Marvel at fact that you have finally become sick of talking about yourself. 11. Accept a string of awards and honors that it would be churlish to turn down, each one leaving you feeling more depleted and foolish than the last. 12. Wonder if your life might be all downhill from here.
Thank you. And I have to say, as testimonial, I tried it. It did give me superhuman strength.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much for coming out here. I hope you had a good time here at Morey Bay and out on the water on the paddleboard going through the mangroves.
Oh my God, it was amazing. I'm gonna come back because I still haven't seen a manatee.
You have to.
The Mattasher Show is made possible by Key West Adventures. See more of Key West. And by Bascom Grooms Real Estate, selling property in the Keys since the early 1900s. And by Keys Weekly, bringing the world to the Florida Keys and the Florida Keys to the world.